Welcome to the 19th Century Charitable Association in Oak Park, where it's our vision to be a dynamic cultural center for community learning. I'm Rich Feingold. I'm a member of the Social Science Program Committee responsible for today's program, and I've been chosen to introduce the speaker. Our mission is to strengthen our community through learning, giving, and sharing our landmark building. Today's program is entitled America's Cemetery, Arlington National Cemetery, and is being presented by one of our members, Paula Fenza. Paula is a retired anthropologist who has always been fascinated with cemeteries. She wrote her graduate school thesis on the social organization of Midwestern American cemeteries. She has published articles in the Journal for the Association of Gravestone Studies and made presentations at their annual conferences. She's also given presentations on cemeteries for a number of Chicagoland organizations. Each year, she's participated as a reenactor at the Oak Park and River Forest Historical Society annual Tales of the Tombstones Cemetery Walk at Forest House Cemetery. She's also performed as a member of the Oak Park and River Forest Historic Personages, including two of the original founders of the 19th Century Charitable Association, Mae Estelle Cook and Elizabeth Ball, and also Lily Pitkin, another member of the club. And I'll turn it over to Paula.
As a member, I have been inspired, enlightened, educated, entertained by these Monday programs, and I'm very honored that you have asked me to share my own particular passion with the rest of you. I love cemeteries. I have always loved cemeteries. No matter where I go, sooner or later, I find a cemetery to explore. My husband is in the audience today. You can ask him how many cemeteries he's been dragged to over the course of our marriage. Whenever I explore a cemetery, I ask, who were these people? What were their stories? What do their tombstones tell me about them? Well, Arlington is a great place to ask those questions because it is quite literally American history laid out at our feet. But before it was Arlington Cemetery, it was Arlington House, the home of Mary Anna Randolph Custis Lee and her husband, Robert E. Lee. When the Civil War began, Robert E. Lee resigned his commission at West Point to lead the Confederate Army, and he sent Mary Anna and their children to stay with relatives away from the danger. Arlington almost immediately was taken over by the Union Army and used it as a headquarters. By 1864, the number of Union casualties had been so great, and they needed a place to bury their dead. So they started burying them on the grounds of Arlington House, starting right here in Mary Anna's Rose Garden. By the end of the war, more than 16,000 bodies had been buried here. Mary Anna and Robert never returned to live at Arlington House. Mary Anna once had her carriage brought up to the door, but she did not leave the carriage or enter the house. Robert never saw it again. After the deaths of Mary Anna and Robert, their son, Custis Lee, petitioned the government, claiming that Arlington House had been seized illegally from his parents. In 1882, the Supreme Court agreed with him and returned the property to him. He immediately turned around and sold it back to the United States for use as a national cemetery. Today, there are more than 245,000 people buried there, and it continues to receive approximately 20 burials every day. The person who brokered this deal was the then Secretary of War, Robert Todd Lincoln, only surviving son of Abraham Lincoln. So thus it was that the two sons of these former adversaries brought about a peaceful resolution of Arlington House. Most people, when they visit Arlington, want to go to its most famous grave, that of John F. Kennedy. On Veterans Day 1961, JFK made his first official visit to Arlington for the ceremony of laying the wreath at the grave of the Tomb of the Unknowns. he stood on a hill overlooking Washington, D.C., and commented that the place was so peaceful, he felt he could stay there forever. Yeah, when he was assassinated just 2 years later, Jacqueline, perhaps remembering this almost prophetic statement, requested that he be buried at Arlington and selected this spot at the top of a low hill for the burial of her husband. Now, as I look out at this audience today, I would suspect that a fair number of us are old enough to remember exactly where we were and what we were doing when we heard the news that Kennedy had been assassinated. And 3 days later, we were glued to our televisions as we watched that beautiful, somber, dignified funeral procession. But we did not see that there were 23 other burials at Arlington on that same day, all of them conducted with the same dignity and respect. And then, of course, in 1994, Jacqueline herself was buried here next to John F. Kennedy. It also contains the remains of their 2 infant children who had died shortly after birth. The Kennedy family members selected these slabs of Massachusetts granite interspersed with sedum and fescue grass ground cover. These were native to New England. They wanted to create this grave that resembled the rocky New England coast where JFK had played as a boy. And of course, Jacqueline Kennedy herself lit the eternal flame that still burns. It's surrounded by a low concrete wall on which are inscribed some of his more famous quotes, including, of course, the most famous, "Ask not what your country can do for you." After Robert Kennedy's assassination on June 6, 1968, his family asked that he be buried here next to his brother. He is on a low hill, at the base of the low hill where his brother's tomb is located. At his funeral, his younger brother, Teddy, eulogized him. Some men see things as they are and ask why. He saw things as they never were and asked why not. Robert's grave is marked with only a flat stone and a wooden cross. He once stated that all he wanted on his grave was a plain wooden cross. Until 2009, this was the only wooden cross in all of Arlington. Of course, on August 25th, 2009, when Ted Kennedy succumbed to brain cancer, the funeral, and I'm sure we all watched that on television, that very beautiful funeral in Boston, and then a procession that brought him here to Arlington, and he is buried next to his 2 brothers. Every president of the United States is entitled to be buried at Arlington. So far, there are only 2. William Howard Taft being the second one. A number of firsts happened during Taft's administration. He was the first and only person who served as president and subsequently as Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Taft was also the first president to throw out the ceremonial first baseball pitch of the baseball season, a tradition that has been honored by every subsequent president except one. Yeah, I can make that remark to this group. During Taft's presidency, both the North and the South Poles were reached by manned expeditions for the first time. Taft was also the first president to own an automobile. Taft was responsible for the cherry trees that are famous now in Washington, D.C. On a visit to Japan, his wife admired them so that the Japanese emperor presented her with a gift of some of the trees, and they began planting them in Washington, D.C. Taft also holds the dubious distinction of being America's heaviest president, weighing in at some 330 pounds. In addition to all presidents, All Supreme Court justices are also entitled to be buried here at Arlington. William O. Douglas was the longest-serving justice in the history of the U.S. He was a justice for more than 37 years. He's also considered the most liberal justice ever to sit on the court. Thurgood Marshall was the first African-American justice to sit on the Supreme Court. Prior to his appointment, he was a civil rights attorney and the leader of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He won 29 of the 32 civil rights cases that he argued before the Supreme Court, including the landmark Brown v. Board of Education. Earl Warren presided over what was called the Warren Court, a major shift in American constitutional jurisprudence. He was recognized by many as a constitutional revolution in the liberal direction. He was also the Chief Justice who presided over the special commission to investigate the assassination of JFK. And we all know that was covered up, right? He's also considered to be one of the most influential of all Supreme Court justices in the history of the United States. After the Kennedy graves, the most famous and frequently visited memorial in Arlington is that of the Tomb of the Unknowns. When World War I ended on November 11th, 1918, there were more than 16,000 American soldiers buried in France where they had died. In response to public sentiment, Congress passed a resolution providing for the burial of an unknown American soldier at Arlington to represent all the American dead of the Great War. On October 24th, 1921, one body was selected, transported to Arlington, and buried here with ceremony in what's called the Amphitheater of the Unknowns. After World War II, formal plans were made to inter an unknown soldier from the Second World War. It was to take place on Memorial Day, 1951. But unfortunately, before the ceremony could be planned, the Korean War broke out, and it was delayed. In 1956, Dwight Eisenhower signed legislation to honor both a World War II unknown and an unknown from the Korean War. On Memorial Day, 1984, an unknown soldier from the Vietnam War was also buried here. In 1998, that body was exhumed for possible identification. Using newly developed DNA technology, he was identified as Lieutenant Michael Blassie of St. Louis. At the request of his family, his body was returned to his family and is buried in the family plot in St. Louis. Thanks to DNA analysis, we can hope that there will never again be another unknown soldier from America's wars. The tomb is guarded 24 hours a day by the 3rd United States Infantry, known as the Old Guard. Each sentinel walks exactly 21 steps from the guardhouse to the center of the memorial. He turns to face the tomb for 21 seconds, turns again, pauses another 21 seconds, then retraces his steps back another 21 steps. The number 21 is symbolic of the highest honor offered in military ceremonies. Think of the 21-gun salute. When my own father died in 2018, he was a former Marine and World War II veterans. One of the most moving things about his cemetery was when veterans stood at his grave and gave him the 21-gun salute. If you've never been to Arlington and you have a chance, go see this ceremony. It is probably one of the most moving things that you will ever see. War heroes are also represented at Arlington. Elmer Bradley took over the command of the American Army from George Patton during World War II. Following D-Day, he led the largest force ever commanded by an American field officer across Europe and into Germany. I took this particular picture from my best friend, Corey. Her father was career military. He served in World War II under both Patton and Bradley. He spoke often about his admiration for Bradley's valor and integrity. He also said Patton was an SOB, but that's a topic for a different Audie Murphy desperately wanted to join the Marines, but he was both too young and too short to be accepted. After his sister helped him falsify a birth certificate, he was finally accepted by the 3rd Infantry Division in World War II. By the end of World War II, he had become the most decorated soldier in American history. He earned 28 medals, including the Medal of Honor, 2 Silver Stars, 2 Bronze Stars, 3 Purple Hearts, the Distinguished Service Cross, the French Croix de Guerre, and also the Belgian Croix de Guerre. Yet at the end of the war in Europe in May of 1945, he had not yet reached the age of 21 years old. After the war ended, he was featured in an article, and his photo was on the cover of Life magazine. It attracted the attention of all people, James Cagney. Cagney encouraged Murphy to come to Hollywood to try his hand at show business. Cagney mentored him and brought him to the attention of movie producers. Ultimately, he made more than 40 films. His best movies are considered The Red Badge of Courage and To Hell and Back, where he portrayed himself in a film version of his exploits during the war. He died in 1971 in a small plane crash. He was still only 46 years old. Come on. This one, I really like this guy. Gregory Pappy Boyington was one of the most colorful and daring pilots of World War II. In September of 1943, he took command of a Marine fighter squadron known as the Black Sheep Squadron. He shot down a record 28 enemy planes before his own plane was shot down, and he was taken prisoner by Japanese troops. He was in a Japanese prison camp for almost 2 years before he was released shortly before the end of the war. Upon his return to the US, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. In 1958, he wrote his autobiography, Baa Black Sheep, which was the basis for the popular TV series back in the 1960s, Black Sheep Squadron, if you'd ever watched it. If you want to watch episodes of it, you can find them on YouTube. At the age of 21, Samuel D. Hammett joined the Pinkerton Detective Agency. He served in both World War I and World War II. In World War II, he was considered too old for combat, so he served as an editor for the military newspaper. However, we know him better as Dashiell Hammett, author of the Maltese Falcon and creator of such memorable characters as Sam Spade and the Thin Man, who became, again, a popular TV series. It's on YouTube. After World War II, Hammett became very active in civil rights issues. He came under investigation of the House Un-American Activities Commission, better known as the McCarthy Witch Hunt. He was investigated extensively by the FBI that maintained a huge file on him. When he died in 1961, he had expressed the desire to be buried at Arlington, and his family tried to have that done. The FBI objected, but the family persisted, and he is buried here as his own wishes demanded. One person that is not buried at Arlington is Lillian Hellman, the Pulitzer Prize-winning American playwright who wrote such masterpieces as The Little Foxes. Any person who is buried at Arlington is entitled to have his or her spouse buried next to them. Hammett and Hellman lived together for more than 30 years, but they never married, so she was denied burial at Arlington. A lot of people are surprised to realize that Lee Marvin is buried at Arlington. We tend to think of him more from his tough guy persona as the hard-boiled detective in the TV series M Squad, YouTube, or his Academy Award-winning performance as the drunken gunslinger, Kid Shalene, in the movie Cat Ballou. We just watched that movie again recently, still as funny as it ever was. But he did serve with distinction as a Marine in World War II. He served in the Pacific Theater. He earned a Purple Heart when he was shot during the Battle of Saipan in 1944. At 6:31 p.m. on January 27th, 1967, Virgil Gus Grissom, Roger Chaffee, and Edward J. White were strapped into a Saturn rocket, preparing for a simulated liftoff in preparation for the first scheduled February 21st launching of the first Apollo mission into space. 10 minutes before the liftoff, the capsule exploded in a massive explosion that tore apart the rocket and killed all 3 of the astronauts instantly. The bodies of all 3 astronauts were recovered from the spacecraft. 2 of them, Gus Grissom and Robert Chaffee, are buried here at Arlington. The third, Edward White, per his family's request, is buried at his alma mater, West Point. These stones are very simple, military issue type stones, very characteristic of Arlington. They don't mention the tragedy, they just mention their military service. However, their burials here are marked with a memorial that these were the first deaths in the space program in service of the United States. And it's particularly fitting that they're buried next to another man named Thomas Selfridge. Thomas Selfridge died on December 17th, 1908. He was testing a Wright brothers aircraft for the United States. He was the first air fatality among the American armed services, just as Grissom, Chaffee, and White were the first fatalities of the space program. So it's particularly fitting that they are buried next to each other here at Arlington. We probably all were watching all of this too. 11 other astronauts are also buried at Arlington, including the ones here. At 11:38 a.m. on January 28, 1986, Americans, me among them, were watching as the Space Shuttle Challenger was launched from Cape Canaveral. The shuttle mission generated a lot of interest because this was the first civilian in space, a school teacher named Krista McAuliffe. She was selected from a number of applicants to be the first civilian. As we all watched, 73 seconds into the launch, the Challenger exploded in a ball of flame and smoke. I think we can all remember that circular plume of smoke over in the air over Cape Canaveral. It was several weeks after the explosion that they were able to recover the remains of the 11 crew members. What they could identify, they did. All remains that were identifiable as belonging to an individual person were returned to the families for burial. Unfortunately, not all of the remains could be identified. Remember, this was in 1986. DNA analysis still hadn't even begun to be used for identification. So, on May 26, 1986, all of the unidentified remains were commingled and buried here together in a single grave at Arlington, dedicated to the memory of all of the crew members who died in that explosion. Oh, this is another one we all remember. Okay, not personally, it took place in 1898, but on February 15th, 1898, the battleship Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, precipitating the Spanish-American War. Of the 260 men who died in the explosion, 66 were aboard the ship. They sank to the bottom of the harbor, along with the ship. The rest of them were buried on land in Colón Cemetery in Havana. For years, the mast of the Maine was the main feature to be seen in Havana Harbor as it stood there. Finally, in 1910, it was decided to retrieve the bodies of all of the 260 men and bury them here with honor at Arlington. In March of 1912, the wreckage of the Maine was raised from the bottom of the harbor, and those bodies were recovered. The ones that were buried in Havana were disinterred, and everyone was brought here to Arlington. They retrieved the mast of the battleship Maine, and that does serve as the marker for this memorial. The Spanish-American War was a 10-week conflict. Very short war, but interesting. It was just the spring and summer of 1898. Cuba had been waging a war of independence against Spain since 1895, and that effort was largely supported by the United States, which had extensive economic interests on the island. To ensure the safety of American citizens and property in Cuba, the United States sent the battleship Maine. And of course, when it exploded, war was declared. With only 25,000 men in the United States Army at the time, there was a need for more than 100,000 to prosecute the war. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, convinced the Secretary of War, Russell Alger, that he could raise an all-volunteer force of 1,000 men and form a cavalry unit for the war in Cuba. Although it was formally named the first United States Volunteer Cavalry, the press nicknamed it the Rough Riders, because most of the men that Roosevelt recruited were cowboys, frontiersmen, railroad workers, some even Native Americans who had led a rough life before they joined this cavalry unit. The 1,060 Rough Riders that Theodore Roosevelt recruited arrived in Santiago de Cuba on June 19th. On July 1st, the regiment participated in the Battle of San Juan Hill. Of course, the famous charge up San Juan Hill, and they dislodged a Spanish force, which actually had superior firepower, but Roosevelt and his Rough Riders were able to overcome them. This monument was established at Arlington in 1907. Several of those original Rough Riders are buried here at Arlington. Theodore Roosevelt is not. I think that's too bad. He's kind of a president that I really liked and would love to have seen him buried here. Okay. On June 28th, 1866, Congress authorized the creation of 6 regiments of African American soldiers known as the United States Colored Troops. Their first tours of duty were mostly in the American West, where they helped build forts, strengthen telegraph wires, protected settlers, work such as that. The name, Buffalo Soldiers, is believed to have originated with Native Americans, who had a great admiration and respect for these soldiers. They said those soldiers had the courage of the buffalo. During a time when nearly a third of all Army enlistees deserted, the Buffalo Soldiers had one of the most admirable records in the history of the American military. They had the lowest desertion and court-martial convictions of any of the divisions. Between 1870 and 1890, 14 Buffalo Soldiers were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. The Buffalo Soldiers also participated in the Battle of San Juan Hill, right next to Roosevelt's Rough Riders. So it's particularly fitting. These 2 monuments are right next to each other in the cemetery, because that is how they served. Athletes are also represented at Arlington. Abner Doubleday served in the Mexican War in 1848 and later in the Civil War, including battles of Bull Run, Antietam, and Fredericksburg. He was recognized for his command of the troops at Gettysburg. He retired from the Army in 1873, and he moved to San Francisco, where he started the first cable car company in America. So if you've ever visited San Francisco and ridden on the iconic cable cars, you have Abner Doubleday to thank for that experience. And now I'm going to break the hearts of all you baseball fans. Contrary to belief, Abner Doubleday did not invent baseball. No, I know, I'm sorry, but I have to tell you the truth. Variations of the game had been played even before the Civil War. What Doubleday did was collect all of the disparate rules of the game and unify them into a single unified set of standards. For this, the Baseball Commission dubbed him the father of American baseball. Joe Louis. Joe Louis's proper name was Joseph Louis Barrows, but when he fought his first amateur fight, he listed himself as Joe Louis. During the 1930s and 40s, he was the heavyweight champion of the world, losing only one of his 69 fights. When America entered World War II in 1941, Joe Louis enlisted in the Army. In fact, he served in the same segregated unit as Jackie Robinson, who later went on to break the color barrier in baseball. Although Louis did not participate in any battles, he was a bit older by that point, he entertained troops with a series of exhibition games. He also donated more than $100,000 of his own money to Army and Navy relief efforts. By the end of the war, he had reached the rank of sergeant. After the burial of JFK at Arlington in 1963, this became such a desirable place to be buried that the cemetery had to establish rules for who could be buried there. One of the rules is that the deceased had to be an active member of the military and died in service of the country to be buried at Arlington. When Joe Louis died in 1981, he had been retired from boxing and the Army for more than 32 years. However, he was so well loved and respected that President Reagan signed an executive order that Joe Louis could be buried at Arlington with full military honors. This is one of my favorites. This is the memorial to the Polish pianist Ignacy Paderewski. When the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, Paderewski was performing in New York. He was not able to return to Poland. He was named president of the organization of the Polish National Council, the Polish government in exile. He declared that he would not return to Poland until it was free. Unfortunately, he died in New York City in 1941. After the war, as we all know, the Nazis were driven out, but the Soviets came in. The US government offered to return his body to his family, but they said no. They said he wanted to come back to a free Poland, and Poland was not yet free. In 1992, after the fall of the Soviet Union, his body was disinterred and finally returned to a free Poland. Although his body is now buried in Warsaw, this memorial continues to be here, a cenotaph, to demonstrate our commitment to our worldwide allies. Women have served this country in every war, going back to the Revolution. However, until 1986, Arlington was pretty much a male bastion. In 1986, the Women's Memorial was dedicated, and in this section are monuments to women who served in America's wars. Some of the first ones to be brought here. Marie-Therese Rossi was the first woman in American military history to serve in combat as an aviation unit commander during the Persian Gulf War in 1991. And she was the first woman pilot in US military history to fly combat missions. She was killed when the helicopter she was piloting crashed in Saudi Arabia on March 1st, 1991. Sarah Matilda Cox was an American nurse, one of what were called the Sacred 20, the first 20 women admitted to the United States Navy Nurses Corps in World War I. She was superintendent of the nurses at the Naval Hospital in Washington, D.C. Ethel R. Thompson served as an Army nurse in the Army Nurse Corps in World War I. Grace Bruce Hopper was an American computer scientist, mathematician, and U.S. Navy Rear Admiral. She was the first to devise the theory of machine-independent programming languages, including COBOL, an early high-level programming language that is still in use today. I always like to end my talks with this grave. This is Captain Charles Burlingame. Captain Burlingame was the pilot of American Airlines Flight 77 that was hijacked on 9/11 and crashed into the Pentagon. His body was recovered from the wreckage, and he's buried here at Arlington on a small hill that actually overlooks the Pentagon. It's a little spooky because when you're standing at Captain Burlingame's grave, if you had been standing there on 9/11, you would have seen his plane crash into the Pentagon. I've always found this to be one of the most moving burials at Arlington, probably because that was such a significant event in our history. I also use Captain Burlingame to illustrate a point that I always make. A number of years ago, I attended a seminar by a woman who was a self-proclaimed cemetery expert. And her expertise consisted of showing slide after slide after slide. Here's a tombstone. Here's another tombstone. Look at this tombstone. I finally raised my hand and asked, but what do they mean? She looked at me like she was confused. And I repeated, what do they mean? What do they tell you about the people who are buried there? And then she made a statement that just shook me right down to the tips of my cemetery-loving toes. She said, "They don't mean anything. Cemeteries aren't about people." Yeah, I dissented, and a lively discussion ensued. I don't think she liked me very much, because pretty much the entire rest of the audience was behind me saying, "Yeah, she's right. What do they mean?" Which brings me back to Captain Burlingame. It is my contention that this simple military tombstone with just one date tells the story not only of Captain Burlingame, but also of 3,000 other people. And that's why I say every tombstone tells me a story. And with that, I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Hi, Paula.
Hi.
I just wanted to give you one more person that is at Arlington, and that is our own president, Faye Devine. Or Faye Devine? Devine. So she and her husband are also buried at Arlington Cemetery. But I was just wondering, also, there are tombstones that are like this. They're all the same.
Yes.
And the other ones are different. So is there a change in philosophy about what is...
Most of the military tombstones look like this and continue to look like this. Some of the other tombstones may have been people who were private citizens at the time of their death, or at least not members of the military service. Members of the military service get this tombstone.
Thank you, Paula. That was wonderful.
Thanks, Brian.
What are the current criteria for being buried at Arlington Cemetery?
You must be an active member of the military at the time of your death and or died in the service of this country. As I said, it has to be limited. Vast as the cemetery may seem, it is ultimately going to get filled up. So they do have to limit, but it is still a working cemetery. And as I said, every U.S. president, every U.S. Supreme Court justice automatically is entitled to be buried there. Spouses are entitled to be buried with their husband or wife.
I'm a Vietnam vet, and I'd like to be buried in Quantico. Have you been to Quantico?
No, I have not.
Okay.
But I understand your desire to be buried there in recognition of your service.
Yeah. I applied, and there's a procedure you go through, and they don't guarantee a place anywhere. And it depends, I think, on when you die, what's available. Okay. Thank you.
You talk about people are entitled to bury. What's the actual process that one goes through to be accepted to be buried at Arlington? Who makes those final decisions?
The Commission for the Direction of Arlington Cemetery. So one applies to the commission, which oversees all burials here.
I'm just curious, how many military cemeteries are there, not only in the United States, but also around the world?
Oh my goodness, I have no idea. I'd have to look it up. There are a lot of them. We actually have one right here just south of Chicago, the Abraham Lincoln National Cemetery. A couple years ago, Jim and I were in Santa Fe. There's a fantastic military cemetery there with graves going all the way back to people who died in the Civil War. And another interesting thing, any cemetery that is located in another country, that cemetery is considered U.S. soil. So the United States has jurisdiction over that property. I once worked with a woman whose daughter was in charge of the Normandy Cemetery, and she was there as a U.S. citizen on a U.S. property.
I'm just curious what led you into this hobby or interest of yours.
I grew up in a house that's across the street from a cemetery. When I was a child, my mom and my cat and I used to go for walks in the cemetery. My mom told me stories about the people that are buried there. My cat liked to hide behind tombstones and leap out to pounce on us as we walked past. So I grew up with the idea that cemeteries were a place of learning about people. And incidentally, both of my parents are now buried in that cemetery. And yes, I did make sure that their tombstones tell their story. And I also semi-illegally buried their last cat there. It is illegal to bury animal remains in a human cemetery. Sure. They had a beloved cat, Olivia, who outlived both of them. She died about a year after my dad did. We had her cremated, and I just went to the cemetery and we dug a little hole and dumped the ashes into the hole because it just seemed appropriate that their cat should be there between them.
I have a question, maybe if there's anything the public can do about this rumor that's been floated about a triumphal arch that's going to be built by the current administration that's going to somehow obscure some of the view from Arlington. And whether you've heard anything about that or what's being done.
Oh, yeah, I've heard. Usually I try not to insert politics into my presentations, but I already made the snarky baseball comment. Dear Lord, I hope not he would desecrate this sacred space. We know that this is protected in addition to being a cemetery. It is a National Historic Monument. But I think we have seen that he has absolutely no respect for national monuments. I don't know what's going to happen, but anybody who wants to start the crusade to prevent it, I'll be there. If you actually look, this is the gate to the cemetery, and it actually almost does have an arch at the entrance. Why would we need another one? This is a beautiful entrance. It's moving. It sets the stage for the whole cemetery. We do not need a gaudy, gold-plated arch.
I wanted to ask, how large is Arlington National Cemetery? Do you know?
I forget how many acres. It's huge.
It's very. Is it the original?
It is the original land that belonged to Mariana Randolph Custis Lee
Okay.
and Robert E. Lee. And it essentially, it was a working farm in their day, as much of the land in that area was.
Paul, I just want to thank you. I was at Arlington Cemetery a number of years ago, but I did not realize all these graves were there of different people, famous Americans and those who served in the military. So I appreciate all this talk, and I hope to go back there again and really see it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. As I said, there are 245,000 graves there. I couldn't talk about all of them. I tried to select a few that I thought were most interesting or most unusual. I mean, who would have thought of Lee Marvin being buried there? But there are many monuments in this cemetery that are beautiful and moving. And as I said, it's American history laid out at our feet.
Are there tours given
Yes.
that you can
Yes.
sign up for that take you around to
Yes,
where
there
these are?
Mm-hmm.
One question, thank you. I also was wondering if the Robert E. Lee, is it a museum now, or what's happening with the house?
It has been refurnished. None of the furnishings are original, but it was refinished to look the way that it did when Mariana and Robert lived there, and you can go through the house and tour it.
Are there any plans to do DNA analysis of the other soldiers that are buried at the Tomb of the Unknowns?
No, those bodies have been buried for far too long. DNA degrades after a certain amount of time, especially going back to the World War I soldier. No, there would not be enough DNA analysis to identify that person.
Has the Arlington Cemetery always been integrated?
Yes.
I've had the honor of being able to attend a military service on Memorial Day at the cemetery in Luxembourg. It would have been 1965. And it just astounded me as a citizen to see all these people who lived in that community, going to the cemetery on our holiday,
Yes.
taking flowers to the people that defended their country and were buried in their cemetery. And when the Air Force plane strafed down over the field, and our ambassador at that time to Luxembourg was the presider of that occasion, it was the most touching thing. And you were so proud to say, yes, I am an American. This is my country. This is our flag. And to know that they were respected so greatly.
Now, my husband and I happened to be in Normandy around the 70th anniversary of the D-Day landing. Everywhere we went, people asked us, did you have a family member who was here? And in fact, yes, my dad's cousin was with the landing forces on D-Day. And they all thanked us for coming to save their country. Now, of course, Jim and I certainly had nothing to do with World War II. We're too young. But they still thanked the Americans. 2019, we were in Paris, and they had this event where you could get a ride in a classic car. So we took a ride in one of these cute little antique cars. It was supposed to be about a 15 to 20-minute ride. The guy who took us around gave us a 45-minute ride, and he said he came from Normandy. Now, he was younger, he was like us, he was not alive, he did not witness the war, but he said he always liked to give Americans a special ride because we came to save his country.
Oh.
So there is a memory there.
I also visited Normandy when our government was shut down. And the people that were on our bus, we thought we were going to be able to go into the cemetery. The cemetery was closed. And our flag was not flying. The people on our trip were just blistering angry. How dare these people fought for us and fought for that country, and how dare the government not recognize and open the doors for those individuals.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
Letters went to Congress off that bus, I'll tell you. They were furious.
And going back to your Luxembourg cemetery, that's where George Patton is buried. Thank you. Thank you.